Good morning, folks. It is nice to be with you. It would be even better to be in your presence, but that'll have to wait till next week. This morning, we are going to finish our sermon series, Revival in Our Times, because we are praying, we are working for, we're hoping and seeking after God's face for the sake of revival in our times. And this morning, I want to ask the question, what are we doing here? And of course, I told me, what are we doing in our living rooms in our pajamas? We know the answer to that. Why is our church here? What are we doing here as a community of faith? And I believe we're here because God is asking us to be about building something to last. In the 16 to 1700s, a half-literate Italian craftsman named Antonio Stradivari designed one of the most beautiful sets of instruments the world had ever seen. Today, those violins named after him, Stradivarius, are considered priceless. In 2010, a Stradivarius was sold for $3.6 million. It is believed that there are only about 500 of these instruments still in existence, some which have been submitted to the most intense scientific scrutiny and examination as they attempt to reproduce the quality of Stradivarius. Today, we know quite a lot about these instruments. We know that Stradivari used spruce wood for the top, willow for the internal blocks and lining, and maple for the back, ribs, and neck. He also treated the wood with several types of minerals, including potassium borate, sodium, and potassium silicate, as well as a handmade varnish, which appears to have been made out of gum arabic, honey, and egg white. But the genius of this craftsman was never once recorded for posterity. Instead, it was passed on through a series of apprentices, what one scholar calls elbow learning. The apprentices of the great Stradivari didn't learn their craft from books or from manuals, but by sitting at the elbow of the master, feeling the wood as he felt it, to assess it for its length, its balance, and its timbre. They sat at his elbow as his fingertips mixed the varnish. And all of this learning happened person to person. Stradivari's most noted apprentice was Carlo Bergonzi, whose family, the Bergonzis, would become one of Italy's most famed families of luthiers, and the luthier being, of course, maker of stringed instruments. The skill and the craftsmanship of Stradivari was passed on in a very intentional way, and it was that intentional process that has made Cremona, Italy, famous for its fine instruments. And this leads me to one of the saddest chapters in Methodist history, and it's about one of the most important founders of Methodism. See, there were two forms of Methodism in the early part of the revival. There were the Arminian Methodists that were led by John and Charles, and there were the Calvinist Methodists led by this man, George Whitefield. George Whitefield was born in December 16, 1714, in Gloucester, England, and he attended Pembroke College in Oxford, where he met John and Charles Wesley. He was one of the original Oxford Methodists, and he was its most famous preacher. In fact, he became one of the most famous preachers in all of Great Britain and the Americas. The Anglican Church did not assign George to a pulpit. So he began to preach in the marketplaces, in the fields, anywhere there were people. And he began to bring people to Jesus. He was small in stature, kind of strange looking in the face, but had a melodic voice, what some people called angelic. He had an emotional style of preaching, and he soon began to attract crowds of thousands, sometimes as large as 30,000 people. He became, in America at least, one of the first real celebrities. But his ministry is nearly forgotten by Methodists today. And there's a really good reason. See, unlike the Wesleys and their co laborers, Whitefield left nothing lasting. He would preach, he would usher people into the kingdom of God, but then he would move on to another area. And the results were short lived. The people in the areas where he preached would be on fire for God for a month, for two, maybe even a year or two. But before long, the flame would flicker out. Why? According to John Wesley, it was because George Whitefield was building a rope made of sand. See, he would assist people in the new birth, but then he would leave the newborn babies abandoned to fend for themselves against the devil. In other words, these new converts would get no supervision, no guidance, no structure, and soon these new converts would slip out of faith and back into their old unbelieving ways. John and Charles Wesley, John Fletcher, Sarah Peck, Francis Asbury, and their leaders, they made a different kind of response to the work of God. And this reminds me of something that we said early in this sermon series. See, the reason I'm fascinated with John and Charles and the revival they led is not because I think they were super saints. It's not because I think they're to be venerated alongside of the Virgin Mary. My obsession with these two men is that the revival they led lasted for more than 150 years in Great Britain. It lasted for more than 200 years in North America and is still burning bright in places all across the world. And I believe that we can learn some really, really valuable things from them and their fellow workers. There are four things that I want to highlight, things that I think we can learn from and imitate in our own time and place. The first is the early Methodists were committed to doing whatever it took to reach non-religious and nominally religious people for Jesus. And there really are just two components when it comes to evangelism, outreach, whatever we want to call this. But there's really just two components. The first is we look for every excuse and we look for every creative way to tell people about Jesus and God's love. And then number two, we look for every creative way we can to show people God's love. Our words and our deeds go together. We tell people about Jesus and we demonstrate God's love through our actions. It really is just that easy. And the early Methodists were committed to doing everything they could do to bring people to a saving knowledge of Jesus. Number two, they were intentional about building community. This is the real difference between what John and Charles did versus what George Whitefield did. See, the crowds that responded to the early Methodist preaching were thousands. And John and Charles and their fellow co-workers, they knew that they could not disciple every single one of these people. Neither could they be the point of contact for every one of these people, nor could they be their primary relationship with the church. And so what they did is they took these early converts and they put them into groups where they could build friendships and networks of relationships. They could watch over one another in love. They could encourage each other to grow in grace. And together they would build something to really last. As we see new people come in our church, we need to be really careful that we don't develop a backdoor problem. See, a lot of churches are good at attracting people, but they're not good at building these relationships. And relationships are the glue that hold a church together and allow it to 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 have progress over time, to grow over time, to intentionally become something more and to reach more people. Otherwise, if you have a backdoor problem, if you don't have relationships, if you don't have the sticky friendships that hold the church together, as many people will leave as you bring in. The third thing that we can learn from the early Methodists is they gave people a very intentional path for growing in grace. In other words, they taught them how to pray. They taught them how to read the scriptures. They taught them the meaning of communion. They taught them the means of grace. They They gave them a path for growing in grace. They didn't leave it to chance. They didn't ask people to guess or figure it out for themselves. They were intentional of helping people understand the faith that they had been brought into. And one big part of that, of course, was music. Charles Wesley, lots of people think about John, but I always think about Charles as maybe the more significant of the two. See, John maybe wrote the theology, wrote most of the sermons, did the organizing, but it was Charles that taught the Methodists to sing. He wrote more than 6,000 hymns. For the longest time, a new hymnal would come out every 6 to 8 years. Methodists were famous for taking their theology and putting it to music that people could relate to, music that people knew, music people could sing. Almost nobody memorizes a sermon, but thanks to Charles Wesley and Fanny Crosby and so many other great Methodist hymn writers, people could sing the theology. They had the theology memorized and committed to heart. We don't have to be limited to their songs. We can imitate them best by continuing to choose new and good music that embodies our theology and teaches the faith, because what is sung sticks to the mind and the heart and shapes the heart over time. St. Augustine said, "He or she who sings prays twice." Finally, the fourth thing that we can learn from these early Methodists is that they were constantly working to raise up new leaders to serve Christ in the church and in the world. The greatest thing you can do if you're a mature Christian in our church, besides helping build relationships, is to mentor new leaders and to get them into the work early. Help them to go ahead and begin to engage those leadership skills. As we raise up new men and women to serve the cause of Christ, we will be building something that will outlast us. We will be building something to last as we pass it on. So what are the four things that we can learn? Well, the first thing that we can learn from our Methodist forebears is that they looked for every excuse to both tell and show people about the love of Christ. When people responded to that message, they built community. They were intentional about building small groups and Sunday school classes and other forms of relationship networks that would hold those people in the fellowship. Three, they gave every one of those people an intentional path for growing in grace, including powerful, emotional, theologically deep singing. And then fourth, they were constantly training, mentoring, raising up new leaders. Remember, we started this morning by talking about Antonio Stradivari. And remember what he did. He mentored new craftsmen. He taught them elbow to elbow, fingertip to fingertip. He taught them. He passed on his skills to them. And as a result, there is a rich culture of luthiers, musical instrument makers in places in Italy, even to this day. Now, maybe the original Stradivarius might not be able to be reproduced, but some fine, amazing instruments are being made in Italy because Antonio Stradivari nurtured and developed, mentored, and raised up craftsmen who would replace him and continue the work when he was gone. God bless.